Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next of our series of discussions that we've built around this book. We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style. These events have all been co-hosted by the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, the New Press, and Dissent magazine. So if you missed the previous events, please look for links to those in the chat box. Tonight, our focus is going to be on Sarah Leonard's chapter in that book titled The Family of the Future. And our event tonight is also co-sponsored by Lux Magazine, SisterSong, National Women's Liberation, and New York City for Abortion Rights. And you'll also see links to those organizations in the chat box as well. And our panelists for tonight's discussion on family, reproductive justice, and socialism are Sarah Leonard, who edits the forthcoming socialist feminist publication called Lux. She's a contributing editor to Dissent and The Nation, and the author of the chapter that's the stepping off point for our discussion tonight. Jenny Brown is also with us. She's an organizer with National Women's Liberation and a former editor at Labor Notes. She is co-author of the Red Stockings book, Women's Liberation and National Healthcare, Confronting the Myth of America, and the author of Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work. And her latest book is Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now. So thank you, Jenny, for joining us as well. And Vanessa Nisperos is a social worker and community builder in Brooklyn, New York. Sharing her experience as a single mother of twins, Vanessa is an advocate for community engaged parent support. She's worked on behalf of local community-based organizations like the Red Hook Initiative and Girls for Gender Equity. And she and several families founded an African-centered homeschool in Flatbush, Brooklyn, before then becoming a public school parent. Lakia Williams is also with us. She's a young reproductive justice activist based in the South. She's an aspiring abortion provider. She works for SisterSong, the National Women of Color Reproductive Justice Organization, and she hosts the podcast Black Feminist Rants. And finally, I'm here as your moderator tonight. I'm Sunshine Royanian Ludder. I'm an Iranian American by way of Virginia, living in New York City. And I'm also another parent struggling in the time of 21st century capitalism and COVID. But tonight, I'm also here with you as program director for the Democratic Socialists of America Fund. And I'll just say a little bit more about how we're going to run tonight's event. For the first half, we'll have a discussion that will be generated by questions I'll put to the panelists. And in the second half, the panelists will answer questions that you ask in the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask any questions as they come to you during the discussion. The chat box, which we're using right now, on the other hand, we will close for the first portion of the discussion, just so we can focus on the conversation, and then we'll reopen it during the Q&A as well for folks to shout out or make comments to each other. So we're anxious to get to as many of your questions as possible. So we've also asked the panelists to limit their responses to a few minutes each for each part of our conversation. So we will go ahead and close the chat box for the first part of our discussion. And again, just please remember to use the Q&A button to ask any questions that you'd like of the panelists. So to kick us off, Sarah, Lakia, Vanessa, and Jenny, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us tonight. We're eager to hear from each of you on your thoughts in relationship to the points and questions raised by Sarah's chapter. And there's so much to dig in here that there's no way we'll get to it all in one evening, but we'll tackle what we can for tonight. And I just thought I would quote a couple sentences from the chapter tonight to ground our audience who may not have all read the chapter yet on some of the core themes. First of all, Sarah, I loved the opening sentence, so I just have to say it. Capitalism wants everything and nothing from the family. So I thought that was pure poetry and I should get it embroidered somewhere. But also later on, the statement, quote, capitalists need the family to take care for and reproduce workers at no cost, coupled with when we talk about care, we are really talking about life or everything that sustains us day to day that is not wage exploitation. So I really loved those sentences and just, highlighted them as I read because I felt like they really did a great job of grounding us in the themes of your chapter. And I really appreciated that this chapter positions so many aspects of care and reproductive justice as fundamentals of building a socialist society, both at the society level in terms of public provision of care, as well as the supports at the personal level for the time and resources to make our own decisions about reproduction, as well as give care in our households and our broader communities. So perhaps, Sarah, as the author of the chapter, you could take the baton first with a two-part question. Could you speak to what brought you to putting together the chapter in the way you did in terms of what you chose to include and what brought you to really using a democratic socialist analysis of family care and reproductive justice? And then do you have any thoughts to add in light of the events of 2020, given that this book came out in January? Do you think that this year has cast a new light or maybe just a sharper or more public light on the fundamental issues of care, reproductive justice, and family that your chapter raises?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. And I should have included in my intro that, of course, I'm a member of DSA, a longtime member, and especially of the feminist working group in New York. And I wanted to say just a word about Lux first, if I may, before launching into the chapter, because I have to. This is the first time we're talking about the magazine in public. So we've put a link there. There's an early ability to subscribe right now. But I wanted to say that the inspiration for it came out of DSA in a really substantial way, and specifically out of the feminist working group. Specifically because, socialist feminists are certainly at least half of the rising socialist feminist movement, and in my experience, probably more. And I didn't really feel like there was a particular media home for us. And I knew this was important because in DSA, I often saw women coming in through the feminist working group. And if media is a way that people come into the left, like there had to be that equivalent on a media level. It seemed like a really important part of organizing. And second, because I think it's pretty fair to say that like the politics of the girl boss are dead, like we killed them. But we still get hit over the head as socialists with the idea that like we should vote for Hillary or whoever because they're female, and like a constant pitting of feminism against socialism. And like that pitting against will kill all the politics I love. It's so bad. And so I think it's important that we actually create as many institutions as we can that have the credibility to hit back. And so that's the sort of like, that was the inspiration. And there are like many DSA folks involved, but it's also, it's glossy, it's going to be gorgeous. Because we wanted to sort of like profile the people we're interested in, write about the people we're interested in, and actually like do it justice, have it look like a glossy magazine. I grew up reading a lot of like horrible glossy women's magazines, which I still read sometimes. It's gonna look a little bit like that, but full of Marxism. So I just wanted to say that at the beginning. I'm sorry to take a brief detour, semi-detour from the topic at hand. So, go to the link in the chat. So I'm really thrilled to be here with my co-panelists and thrilled to be discussing this, which has become ever more important during COVID. And to just sort of jump off from what you said, Sunshine, in my chapter, when I talk about capitalism wanting everything and nothing from the family, what I was trying to get at was why it both seems so mandatory in the US that you have a family. It's this sort of enforced idea from the time you're very young. And also why that idea is being enforced when, financially speaking, it's harder and harder for people to have families. So, some examples of enforcing the idea of the family, you can take this pretty far back in history, but more recently, Mitt Romney believes the family is a cure for gun violence, and said so when he was campaigning for president. They're like, there's all this gun violence. Like, what should we do? He's like, we just need stronger families. Bill Clinton thought it was going to solve poverty. He said that pretty often. Hillary Clinton thought stronger families were the answer to crime. Obama gave a speech where he described stronger families as, the tool to fight the oppression of Black people in America. Always back to the family. There's no problem that can't be solved by the family, stronger families. And at the same time, millennials are having families later and later. They're less likely to have kids. And one of the reasons is obviously that there's no affordable childcare in this country. It's incredibly expensive to get healthcare. No one can afford their rent, never mind like a mortgage. It's very difficult to sustain life as things are right now in the United States. And so this is a contradiction. And so what I wanted to explore was what sort of work the family was doing there. There's a really fantastic book that I used. I'll just mention a couple of the books that were really essential because I'm pulling heavily from them. Melinda Cooper wrote a book called Family Values, which I found incredibly useful. And Dorothy Roberts wrote Killing the Black Body, probably, like maybe the most important book on the history of the family in America. Incredible book. And one of the things we see is that the family is frequently being used as cover, to cover over other social problems or for the state to not pay for things. So one of the things we see is, Melinda Cooper takes the history way back to like British poor laws that got imported to the US. And the premise was the Industrial Revolution has displaced all these people. Suddenly we're not living at home in like sort of like feudal situations. Everyone is cast out into the factories. Suddenly they're poor people without homes. And suddenly there became a need for some sort of social welfare, which in that time and place was provided by parishes. And the law was that you had to first show that like your family could not take care of you in order to get help from the state. Yes, more family on the call. And that was sort of imported to the States. And the idea has been with us ever since. Any application for welfare from the state is some sort of failure of the family. And one of the ways we can see that is if you look at, in the 1970s, there was a very strong welfare rights movement, which said, no, we're parenting, we're human beings, we deserve resources from the state to support our families. Taking care of our kids, that's what we do all day. That's not working, that's crazy. And it was a very, very strong movement, primarily led by Black women and women of color. And when Reagan was governor of California and wanted to crush this movement, he passed welfare reform there. And in presenting the welfare reform said, this reinforces the family as the building block of society. And so over and over again, we see the way the religious right can promote the family as a source of values, and the neoliberal right can promote the family as that which should absorb all the things the state doesn't want to pay for. And they work together really nicely. This is why the religious right and the neoliberal right get along so beautifully. There are a lot of other examples we could cite, of course, but that's sort of the basic premise. And so when we talk about, any sort of expansion that we want of social services, right now, we are in this obviously dysfunctional stage of capitalism where it's not only as oppressive as it's always been, but it's sort of starting to fail on its own terms, like nothing's working, right? And that's because, capitalism is, we've disinvested from every kind of care for human beings. And, you can see that very, very clearly in the COVID crisis. So we've decimated our healthcare system. And in a health crisis, we are extra screwed. We've decimated our school systems. And so in having to make all these complex shifts to remote learning and those sorts of things, we're really under-resourced. People don't have childcare. It's obviously been the teachers' unions and parents who have been out front in trying to create sane systems because the state has not. So, we need clearly to be shifting money, resources towards the care of human beings in our society. And every time we try to do that, the other side says, that's a job for the family. And so we need to get really critical of this narrative because it's really powerful. No one wants to be against the family. That's poison in American politics. And what our side is really doing is supporting the family in the sense that we support any kind of family form that people want. The point is to give people the resources to live the way they choose instead of trying to coerce people into identical units, which is never how human beings have lived. So that's kind of the overview of what I was trying to get at in the chapter. And I hope we'll talk more about the sort of current situation. But to me, that was why thinking about the family always feels so central to thinking about a socialist politics.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And folks may see that we've had a few kids join us, so we might have some kids in and out of our screens tonight. But thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for bringing in the history. I think that's really grounding for all the issues we're talking about now. Lakia, Jenny, and Vanessa, I'll turn to each of you in turn to ask if you could also share a few of your key thoughts or reflections about the connections drawn in the chapter, and whether you, also the same question to you, whether you think this year has cast a new or sharper light on any of these issues in particular. Vanessa, I'll go to you next.
Thank you so much. I really loved reading the intro paragraph to that chapter, and I wanted to add some color to that, Sarah, for context. I actually grew up in the era of Reaganomic cutbacks in California, and that was kind of like the backdrop to my childhood. And for a period, my mom was a single mother. And when I found out later, and talking to her about it, that she was actually tasked with raising 6 children on $600 and something of aid to families with dependent children, I almost wept for the reality that she had to hold. And I would say, even if I were to change one word, it was that capitalism wants everything for nothing from the family, literally wants everything and not have to foot any of the bill for it. And so I think that that backdrop of that, the idea that, the safety net for society was really just the tax for capitalism, yet it's been stripped away and stripped away. And then we have the crisis of COVID layered on top of that. And it is literally pinching families to their core this year. Part of the work that I've done just to survive as a single mom in a city as expensive as Brooklyn was to scaffold my life with lots of community support, knowing that there are many other contexts outside of American individualism where people have had like really strong kinship networks. So in the Mexican American community, Latin American community, there's the idea of comadres, like there are mothers who are friends who raise kids together. And we've built that sort of from the ground up to be able to sustain as working moms. And so the idea for me that whether somebody is like a working class mother, a working poor family, or a single parent, our politics have already been the politics of survival, just to exist. And this idea of a crisis now being that we each have to be tasked with our own survival is just really putting people in a bind where many people are being pushed to the edges of their survival during this time, and that it's completely unsustainable now that we have kind of seen the failure of the state on this massive level to provide scaffolding for families. For me, it's really scary to think what's going to happen as this crisis extends on beyond a year, potentially into 2 years. Many people are already leaving and having to find other places, having to find other families to then pair up with, having to find other people to rely on. And it's literally in our neighborhood here in Flatbush, there's like moving boxes and people vacating at a rate that I have never seen in the time that I've lived in Brooklyn. And so I would say that the chapter really gave a lot of context for what we're seeing as the cracks and fissures and the unsustainability of tasking families with, one, providing for free all the reproductive labor to be able to be workers, two, supporting us being workers, and now three, being the educators and the caretakers entirely for the families. And it's like you're seeing the dam breaking. And I'm seeing that and trying to support myself, but also trying to support other parents in our network here to either figure out how we're going to sustain through this, especially with the current uptake in cases and going into another winter of this crisis. For some of us, that means we're leaving New York City and probably not coming back.
Thank you, Vanessa. I will move next to Jenny Brown. If you could take a turn at sharing your key thoughts and reflections on what you might add from this year.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. It's great to be here. So my group, National Women's Liberation, has roots in the 1960s women's liberation movement, but we're maybe most famous for leading the effort to make the morning after pill over the counter for all ages, which was something we won after a 10-year battle. And I really like that Sarah included some of the history and this key point that corporate America and the political establishment, both parties, wants to push all the expensive procreation into the family as much as possible. Of course, this has led to the crisis we're all talking about. And we're bearing the brunt of it, but there are a lot of ways that we're pushing back. So I wanted to look at that a little bit. You know, around the turn of the last century, the union movement demanded the right to have a family and a wage that would support a family, right? And this was largely men demanding this. And it was a demand, in a way, for employers to put something towards the family care job. Obviously, it wasn't really achieved in the US, even for the most skilled workers until after World War II. But it became the expectation and the model for all workers, right? Whether they made enough or not to support a non-working spouse. That was what we were going for. But as our wages were pressured and unions were crushed starting in the 70s, you know, we kept up by sending both spouses out to work, ideally, right? But that means that employers were getting 80 hours a week out of each family for the price that they had been paying for 40, if you think about it, right? So, and then child rearing and family care job, you know, the caring for people who are sick, caring for elders who needed help, caring for children, all of that was squeezed into the time before and after work. And then somehow we're supposed to pay for childcare out of our wages, right? Which is becoming increasingly ridiculous. So, well, the demand for the family wage was sexist, right? The argument was you pay men a living wage, then women who are working would be paid less because they don't have a family to support, right? It also made women who were in the home doing the work dependent on their male spouses who were getting the paycheck. But it did have this progressive element, which was that employers were putting something in towards the family care job. And now they're not even doing that, but the change has been kind of invisible. So a lot of times we're blaming ourselves when we can't make it work, right? it seems like we're supposed to be able to do this. And so in my group, National Women's Liberation, we came to kind of the same conclusion that Sarah does in this chapter, which is that rather than go back to a sexist family wage system, we should go forward to a social wage that everybody gets, universal programs, everybody gets, no matter what their employment is, including healthcare, childcare, paid family leave, and shorter work hours for everyone. I mean, a non-sexist equivalent of the family wage demand would be that everybody works a 20-hour week, right? That would get us just back to the 40 hours a week to support a family situation that, you know, that was the goal of the union movement, and to some extent was achieved for some workers in the period after World War II. When we do consciousness raising in my group about having kids, and most of us do have kids, we find, you know, we're in this situation where we want to have kids, but we're hesitant, or we've had one and we're hesitant to have more. The financial constraints, the time, and this is before COVID, right? It makes it hard for us to figure out how to make it work. And as a result, as Sarah mentioned, the US has the lowest birth rate it's ever had. And we call this a birth strike. All these individual decisions to not have kids have led to this. But what's happening now is it's leading to a lot of hand-wringing among the establishment, which actually relies on population growth as part of the way that capitalism stays profitable. It needs a growing economy, and population growth is part of that growing economy. So that has brought us up against the capitalist requirements. So I think that's kind of where we stand and why it seems like such a conflict right now.
Thanks, Jenny. I really appreciate that context. Yeah, that's very helpful. I'd like to also turn to Lakia Williams. If you could also share your key reflections, having read the chapter, and also what you think of it in light of 2020.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Very briefly on the chapter, I really enjoyed it, and I was very excited when I saw the mention of Dorothy Roberts, because that's kind of how I learned about reproductive justice and kind of got into this work. So I was very excited about that. But one thing that stood out to me was the section on housing as a human right. And Sarah kind of describes a European country that has, I think it was Red Vienna, that has like beautiful public housing, and it's paid by taxpayers. And it made me think of, and that she talks about in relation to the US, which has, the quote was, our public housing is run down and denigrated. And I mean, I see that every day, like where my mom grew up and things like that. And it makes me think of kind of this disdain that the US has for poor people, and specifically for Black and brown people and those people that live at the intersections of those identities, and how kind of this capitalistic ideology that we have to like work hard in order to get things. And if we're not working hard, then we deserve to struggle. And even when the US wants to do the bare minimum and like give public housing, outside of all the other things that you said about moral surveillance and things like that, even when we do give public housing, we still expect them to struggle, and we kind of romanticize this struggle and like, oh, this person pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and like, this is like showing like true capitalism. It's supposed to work, and if you work hard enough, it'll work for you, and it's supposed to work for everyone. If it doesn't work for you, then that's kind of your fault and your lack of hard work and just things like that. And so I really enjoyed that section of it because it really related to me, and kind of my understanding of anti-capitalism, how it's really not meant for the liberation of any people. But more so on the part of the question about what I've seen in 2020, I think this year specifically has shown a lot of things that relate to family, reproductive justice, and socialism. Two of the most prominent ones for me are the state-sanctioned murdering of Black people or police brutality, as well as, of course, COVID or healthcare, and how we've seen these manifest and like different reproductive injustices. So the murdering of Black people is a direct reproductive injustice. So before like I get into that, like reproductive justice, I just want to name that and amplify what that is. So it's a political framework and movement created by 12 Black women who are the founding mothers of reproductive justice, or RJ. And they have described reproductive justice as a human rights framework consisting of 4 pillars. So you have the right to bodily autonomy, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent your children in safe and sustainable communities. And so this constant murdering of Black people by the state is a direct violation of reproductive justice. It's a reproductive injustice, because if parents and mothers and family members have to worry about their children and their family members like going outside and just being murdered or sleeping in their beds and getting murdered, they're not able to like fulfill the 4 tenets of reproductive justice and live like these fully autonomous lives, because they have to constantly worry about state-sanctioned murder, which we're seeing in the US and abroad with SARS in Nigeria and things like that. And so that's one thing that has definitely related to the family and the family union. And then we can also tie in like with police brutality and policing and incarceration, when we're sending like these high numbers of people into jails, that's gonna inevitably break up this family unit that we're striving so hard to create. So if we're supposed to have a mom, a dad, and then 2 kids and a dog, if we're constantly sending people in the family away to prison for like minor crimes, how are they supposed to live this ideal that we're supposed to have for the US? And that kind of shows how this ideal isn't for everyone, or it's purposefully set up so that some people can't meet the ideal. And then we use that as a reason to, oh, this is why all the Black people are oppressed and they don't have this and they have disparities. It's because they don't have family. But then even if they try to do that and you put them in prisons, how are they ever going to do it? So it's kind of like seems like it's by design. And the other thing with COVID, I think COVID has really shown this country's disdain for people's lives in the name of profit, and just like prioritizing profits over people, the reopening of cities, reopening of schools, just for the sake of the dollar with no regard for human life. People are dying and we are moving into a business as usual mindset, and like the US is just continuing to run as a business, which it is. And I also want to state that it's also an empire with like imperialistic like hands in so many different countries, and Puerto Rico and Guam and the Kingdom of Hawaii, and how we're just perpetrating all this violence. One, just simply by putting people at risk with having to reopen these cities, but then also just like, and I want to state that it's not only violence on US soil, but where we're being an imperialistic empire in other countries. And then also I feel like we've seen with COVID a class divide that relates to like how this country operates as a capitalist society, where we see essential workers are more times than not Black and brown people, and more specifically poor people. And so people who are able to stay safe and stay in their homes, people like me who can work virtually, those people that tend to have more privilege and more access and more like middle class, where the people who are being put at risk are the people who are poor, just like another disdain for poor people. Because if we really did care, we would just close everything down and we would all be working from home, or we'd all just be, everything would be shut down, everyone could be safe. So those are kind of my takeaways from the chapter and like how it's related to like 2020 so far.
Thank you, Lakia. Wow, I feel like we have an amazing panel here, and I really appreciate everything you all are adding into this. And actually, Lakia, what you just spoke to dovetails perfectly into my next question. But before I go to the next question, I also want to remind our audience to put any questions you want to pose to the panelists into the Q&A box, because we'll be transitioning to that soon. So feel free to go ahead and start putting any questions you want to put forward. But yeah, so I'll open this up for whoever would like to take this first. But the chapter touches on, a lot of topics, of which all of you have spoken to just now, but I'll just name a few of them. Everything from free, unfettered access to abortion and other tools like birth control that give us power over our own reproduction, to childcare, to housing, to policing and incarceration and schooling, to the question of wages and how wages have been cut and cut and cut over, the last 40 to 50 years. And there's a line in the chapter that I'll quote. It says, "Now I know what some of you are thinking. How can all of these things be part of a reproductive justice movement? Won't you dilute the struggle? Well, I'd say just the opposite. By understanding the intersections of reproductive justice with other struggles against capitalism, we can build a stronger movement," unquote. And I'll say that I agree with this assessment. And it really seems to me that the framework of reproductive justice and care, I would call it more of a paradigm than a quote unquote issue. And actually much in the way I see a Marxist or socialist analysis of our economy and our world as a paradigm as well. And I see these two frameworks of reproductive justice and socialism as pretty inseparable, actually. But more often than not, people talk about workers as if workers aren't also unpaid caregivers. And people talk about people doing non-paid care work at home as if they aren't also workers. And people, often, like, even within circles that are working on these issues, they're kind of like talked about as two separate things. So I was just curious to raise that question about, to anyone on the panel who'd like to take it first, about this idea of reproductive justice as a paradigm that is justified in speaking to all of these issues. And, Lakia also just brought up police brutality directly and the killing of Black people, as well as, I'll also add in elder care, which we haven't actually named directly tonight, but as part of the spectrum of care that the family is supposed to be, absorbing magically. As well as when we're elders ourselves, right? Like what's supposed to happen as we all, if we're lucky, become elders. So yeah, I just wanted to ask that question about the paradigm, and the question of how we think and talk about being a worker when we are talking about like a socialist understanding of our world. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I can speak briefly about the reproductive justice and paradigm. I think that is the perfect framing of it. I know myself and SisterSong, we usually say framework instead of like an issue, because reproductive justice comes from like the combination of social justice and reproductive rights. And those are two, social justice has lots and lots of issues within it. So when you combine those two, you can't get like a single issue out of it, but more of a framework that we use to organize and advocate around specific issues, but it's not a specific issue within itself. So I would definitely agree that it's a paradigm and not just like a single issue. And I've never heard like socialism and RJ being directly related, but after you say that, it makes complete sense to me, because a lot of the things that we advocate for as reproductive justice advocates and organizers would be provided by like a socialist society. So I like that you brought that into the space, because I never thought about that before.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on that, or I can also move to the next question?
I can say a couple words. So, socialists focus on workers because of their positive power. We have the ability to run a society without profiteers, and we know that because we're running it right now. We're doing all the work. And then also because of the negative power, which is we have the ability, when unified, which is the key difficult thing, right? To bring the whole thing to a screeching halt and force the changes that we want. So, COVID has made totally clear that how important essential workers are. Before, if you were a grocery clerk or maybe you were a sanitation worker, you were generally dismissed, even thought of maybe as a loser. Now, wow, it turns out that this work is actually a lot more essential than stockbrokers and ad designers and a lot of other things that we are compensated much more handsomely in the society. So, the way that workers make known their that they have power is by striking. And so, our whole idea of the birth strike is that the value of child rearing and childbearing becomes more obvious when we stop doing it, right? We dusted off this early 20th century term, birth strike, which was used to mean, basically to mean accessible birth control by Emma Goldman and others at the turn of the 20th century, because we wanted to draw the parallels between what happens when workers stop working, when they strike, and what happens when women and others stop parenting. Actually what has happened when the birth rate goes down historically in other countries and even here is that the pressure has caused us to win things like lower birth rates in Bulgaria in the 1960s caused the state, and this required feminist pressure, but within this socialist state, they provided 2 years of paid leave to mothers, the right to have their same job back after that, plus child allowances, plus expansion of childcare, plus cafeterias at work so you didn't have to bring your lunch. All of that to decrease the burdens on women at home. And, but Romania, which was right next door during the same period, also had a lower birth rate, and their response was to make it impossible to get an abortion and restrict birth control. So we see the same split today right now in Europe. The lower birth rates are being responded to by a lot of governments are providing a lot more child allowances, free childcare, really long paid leaves, 2-3 years of paid leave, forcing the dads to take it by making it use it or lose it. Whereas in the US, what we see is more restrictions on our abortion and our birth control. So the question is, are we strong enough to make these demands stick? And are refusing to have kids under these rotten conditions could lead to us winning some of these gains. I want to be clear, I'm not calling for a birth strike. What I'm saying is we're already on one, but we haven't been seeing it as a collective demand. We've been seeing it as an individual decision, maybe even blaming ourselves that we can't make it work. So the idea is to make it a collective demand and make our work visible in the way that other workers who go on strike do.
And I can maybe add a small thing to that, which is I really like this question. I think it's interesting to think of these different paradigms or lenses for viewing the problems that we have. And, I come to reproductive justice, like I go everywhere as a socialist. And, there are a lot of tools within socialist thought for thinking about the family, for thinking about gender, and for thinking about care. But historically, we have needed a different lens in order to deepen that analysis. Jenny talked about the post-war era in which workers in America and Western Europe theoretically had the family wage. And that reinforced the idea of a man as the figure of the worker. And so when we think about the fact that any worker is also a caregiver, it was easier to forget that that was true under conditions where, in fact, the factory worker, the sort of paradigmatic factory worker, was not also expected to be a caregiver. And I think, having a sort of explicitly socialist feminist, having a reproductive justice lens to look at these problems, and the problem of capital really being sucked out of the maintenance of life is really important. And I think when you look at these paradigms, you look at some of the most important paradigms right now. You have reproductive justice, which says everything Lakia already said, which is, we don't, obviously we're not just talking about abortion. What about access? What about housing? What about transportation? What about the ability to have a job? What about the ability to have money and stay home? And then you look at, say, an abolitionist framework, which is more important today. And well, it's been important every single day for the last several hundred years. But when we look at the political prominence right now of an abolitionist model, what do we say when we talk about police abolition? For example, we're saying, yeah, defund the police, but put the money towards all these other things. Put it towards mental health care, put it towards housing, put it towards transportation, put it towards healthcare. I mean, these things start to sound familiar. Like, what do we talk about when we talk about health justice? We talk about like public transportation to be able to get there. We talk about housing so you can stay healthy once you get care. We talk about having the money to pay for it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the leaders in these areas of thought and organizing are women, and most of them are women of color. And like you're looking at paradigms that are created by organizers who like know better than to think that you could separate these things, who have a proper view of how these things work. And so these different paradigms sort of center different areas of life or different problems, but they come back to a lot of the same things, as does a socialist framework. And I think, you know, that's why you've seen such powerful alliance among these different strands of politics right now.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question before also turning to some of our audience questions. But at a baseline practical level, there's a line in the chapter that says, quote, organizing where women are not represented is likely to be organizing that fails to address concerns that disproportionately affect women, which I think speaks to actually what everybody was just talking about right now. And while I'll say, I think what's the obvious, that it seems like the end game of what's going on right now at the national level, broadly speaking, is a proactive intensifying of more suffering and violence across many levels. And then we always have this baseline refrain that there's this need to organize ourselves to respond to that. While I fundamentally agree that we need to be organized to respond, we're at the same time literally lacking in time for organizing, right? Like everything that we've been talking about. Outside of organizing for providing day-to-day childcare, organizing attempts to educate kids now outside of school, organizing and providing elder care, organizing attempts at keeping paid work if you happen to have that right now, and that even if you do, it's more random and unstable, and increasingly so for the last 40x years. Which is essentially all the things that that this chapter gets into. So all of this makes it so hard to locate practical connection points between organizing for day-to-day survival and organizing a larger response that affects our longer-term picture, or that's what I'm positing to you all. But do you all see those spaces or not? I mean, do you see how people are arranging to be able to organize despite this crushing demand that's being put on all of us at the household level? Or are we skipping a step to say the first step is to organize? And even if and where it is possible, and I genuinely mean that as a question, you know, where are you all seeing that? How are you seeing it in your lives? What do you see as particularly needed or useful ways of responding to our situation right now? Like giving these realities, like what do we do that does more than help us survive when all we have time for is to get by? So that's a big question to ask anyone to solve for the world, but you know, I thought it was worth talking about. Does anyone want to speak to that conundrum? Yeah, go ahead, Vanessa. That'd be great.
You know, when I saw this question being asked, I really immediately thought of the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. And there's a specific chapter in there that talks to the origins of the American Indian movement and the idea that like Native women from reservations would go around the country, and wherever they landed, people would have like diapers and formula and things ready. And I thought, in contrast to being a young pre-kids community organizer, kind of like the commitment to the struggle bus, that like we were always taking on too much and doing too much, and how unpractical it was once I became a mom to participate in organizing spaces, and how inconvenient it was to show up with like young children to organizing spaces, and what the kind of disconnect was there. In outside of the US, like in the global South, there is an organizing framework that is very much wrapped around the needs of a family and a working class or poor family especially, and how in some ways there could just be a fusion of the two. There could be political education in spaces where a family can be included and the needs of a family can be met. And so in part of how we even came to the point of starting this homeschool in Flatbush that was African centered and vegan was a bunch of parents just saying, there are systems that are wildly not meeting our needs. And on the opposite end of the spectrum of not meeting our needs, they are actually violent for kids of color. So we know what the outcomes are for Black boys and girls in public education. We know that these systems are harmful. So how can families organize to create an alternative to that? And it was literally just meeting together and saying, can we have like enough food here for all the kids? Can somebody facilitate games for the kids? And can we have just enough brain space as parents to begin to build out this framework? And so I think that's something for me that exists as a model, this idea of like kitchen table feminism, that in the process of just breaking bread and cooking together, we will have the space to talk and build out our, our theoretical framework as a starting point. And so I think for me, that's really where organizing has to exist now in this COVID year, is like, where are we? And the contrast, the other wrench in the system is that like one of the things particular to COVID is that we can't be in face-to-face contact as we were before. So where are we creating socially distant alternatives, outdoor alternatives that are meeting some of the immediate needs of families and communities, and also using that as an opening to then provide political education, be talking about some of the things that are really rising up in prominence and giving people a framework to begin to step into. And I think part of that is also to be really expansive of the definition of care, even that care being equated to life, like care can also include the building of community. It could be the building of social connections, the act of creating like loving attachment and nurturing and supporting resilience with children, and doing that through art and nature. Like care can be really expansive, and in meeting those needs, can we then carve out spaces to also deepen connection and deepen specific connection to frameworks and next steps to begin to take collective action as communities. And I wouldn't say that that's an answer, but it's just something that's like becoming more and more necessary. And outside of that, like I don't have the brain space to even begin to participate.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I appreciate that a lot. Would anyone else like to chime in on that?
I just have something really quickly to add. I'm really glad that Vanessa brought up the nonprofit industrial complex. And one thing that I've noticed with working in certain nonprofit spaces, or maybe even this is probably a little bit in all of them, it's that when we go into these spaces and like we work towards liberation and we, try to like dismantle tenets of white supremacy within the culture of the nonprofit industrial complex, we still have those tenets of white supremacy, and we're still operating within the systems that we're trying to dismantle. And it seems that we need to first like organize, like restructure our interpersonal relationships and our one-on-one relationships with people, and like think of ways outside of like white supremacy culture to operate before we can get into spaces together and organize as organizations, because we just replicate the systems that we're trying to get rid of, which seems pretty counterproductive, because then once we're done with that system, we get rid of it. We're just putting in place a system that's remnants of that system as well. So I feel like as a path towards liberation, we need to like do that in a personal work before we can organize on a collective and be all in one accord of, we're not going to abide by these rules that are oppressing us.
Thanks, Lakia. I will go now to one of our audience questions. So I'll put this out and we'll see who would like to take it first. The question is, how do we as socialists practice an intersectional reproductive justice approach to organizing that is actively not class reductionist?
That is very hard to answer in the abstract. That is the entire question of socialist organizing. But still a good one. So I don't think I can answer it in the abstract, but what I will say is, maybe other people can contradict this, but in my experience, class reductionism is much easier in the abstract. It's something that tends to happen when people are talking in sort of grand terms about national politics, and like they're sort of like, we heard a lot that, in the Bernie campaign, like it's Bernie sort of class reductionist, or and that's because we're talking about a platform primarily, and someone who's making public remarks on a national scale. And like what you kind of want to do is just look at their actions, and you can start to tease apart what this means. Like Bernie was a great candidate in many ways. He also appeared to know little to nothing about abortion or childcare. That was a problem. And that was, his lack of familiarity with feminism or racial justice was a huge problem in that campaign. And we can all look at that. And I think it's more helpful to sort of describe the specific problems with that than simply labeling him as class reductionist, which is a term that, I mean, I guess it's fine, but it doesn't mean much to most people. And I think if you're involved in any kind of organizing, it's actually impossible to be class reductionist unless you really are like putting up a wall between yourself and other people, because everybody's coming to organizing work with a range of experiences and histories. And that's gonna feed into the organizing work. Like some of the most interesting, I mean, maybe this responds also to your last question, Sunshine, but some of the most interesting work that I've gotten to be involved with during the pandemic is with my neighbors against this like horrific like gentrification development from hell that a developer is trying to put up across the street. And one of the interesting things about it is, but you're organizing with your neighbors. So people are not like all members of DSA or something coming in with like a set of political givens. People are coming in with a lot of different political givens and like a wide range of different kinds of political experience. And you all work together, you figure it out. And you must be respectful of other people. It's not going to work if you're not. And if someone came into that group and started announcing that like the people who care about historical preservation in this community don't matter because, our only battle is like against capital, they would be laughed out of the room. And so I think when you start, actually engaging in an organizing process, you come to that with respect and integrity. You can't be reductionist.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Anyone else want to chime in on that? And I'll be happy to also move on to another good question we have here. So another question from the audience. Could you talk about how conservative or neoliberal conceptions of the family in general and the family wage in particular are not only sexist, but also heterosexist?
Sure, I can tackle that. So the family wage obviously is sexist in the ways that I mentioned before, but it's heterosexist and really it's part of what Sarah talks about, where they're trying to force people into families. And I think the answer to that is what Lisa Vogel in the mid-70s called free and equal singlehood, right? Our goal should be that everybody should be able to survive without being pushed into a family so that they can decide for themselves without coercion what kind of family structure or no family structure that they want to be in. So I think that's the goal, and I think that takes in a lot of the heterosexism and the other kind of things that we're constantly dealing with, where the family is this ideal. You see a lot in at least among the right wingers that I've studied, the sort of the Reformicon Republicans, Jeb Bush, a lot of them, Rick Santorum, a lot of them talk about the destruction of the family with marriage equality means destruction of the family. And what they really mean by family is women's unpaid labor within a heterosexual family, right? That's what they're going for. And and you really get this sense that they want to force everybody into this structure because that's the and they even say it, people will stop having kids if we have marriage equality, because it's a family, it's a child production unit, and that's the only acceptable child production unit. It's the most efficient. You also see this in welfare policy, where they're constantly wasting money on these marriage promotion schemes rather than giving people the damn money that they need to survive. They're forcing people to take these classes on getting married and forcing people, you know, but it's all a scam. And the scam is that it's actually, if you get two people with very low incomes together, then suddenly, and they marry, suddenly they're over the limit to get welfare. So then they can be cut off. I mean, it's all really about doing exactly what Sarah's talking about, putting all of the burdens back into the family. It's most efficient if you're in a heterosexual married situation to do that.
Thanks for getting right to the point on that, Jenny. Would anyone like to add to that?
I just wanted to add another component of the heterosexist and sexism in work and wages. Also, the sort of fields that are feminized, and like the caretaking fields, and when I'm thinking of like educators and social workers, are just very low paid. It's like considered subpar work because it's on a parallel to the caretaking work of the family that women have been assigned to. And it's just something that's like super pervasive. And we're still seeing now, especially as folks were saying with essential work and essential workers and hospital workers, especially during COVID. And then the flip side of that, as Jenny was saying, is also the like heavy policing for women to access aid, like literally needing to reveal information about somebody who is then tracked down and can be policed and can be incarcerated for me to ask for aid for myself. So the entire setup of the safety net here is predicated on the idea that there is a heterosexual nuclear family that will be punished if anyone in that unit is in poverty completely. And as Jenny was saying, it's like, it's also handicapping people that happen to be in a specific income bracket. So I'm like, I will have more benefit if I'm just more poor than I am now than making the wage that I am now. So it's completely predicated on a heterosexist norm and punishing everything outside of that.
I couldn't agree more with that analysis. So maybe I'll move to, we have another question coming in from the audience, which is, how can we create closer alliances with the movement for affordable quality childcare to the movement for domestic worker justice? Would anyone like to speak to that?
I mean, I feel like
I have a one-word answer: unions, unionization.
I think another facet, and it's something that Sarah spoke to in the book as well, is that many of the folks that are organizing for domestic worker justice here in the United States have families that they've been separated from and that they are then repatriating money to. And so the question is deeper to say, how do we create like even an international alliance for what it means to support a family? And I think that is like deeper political education for folks that are organizing for quality, affordable childcare here, to start to be invested in the communities that are then being paid for caretaking. There's a wonderful documentary that Lakia Williams in the Bronx created called Through the Night, a documentary about the 24-hour childcare that is necessary for people to be able to work the hours that they are in places like New York City and around the country. And so being deeply invested in the families that are providing care and also being invested in the children of the people providing caretakers is I think it's like around deep relationship building and building political analysis around that.
I'll also say childcare workers and parents are natural allies, but they're pitted against each other because the parents are trying to scrape together the money to pay for the childcare, right? So it's completely insane. And in cities where there's been a lot of childcare worker organizing, and the parents have been an obvious ally in that, like Seattle, that's the way to go. And obviously we need to organize for, a national childcare system, and lacking that, state childcare systems that provide all of the care. This, and including the hours issue that Vanessa mentioned. In fact, Bernie's plan, childcare plan, had pretty good stuff around the hours that it would be available. And it's a pretty comprehensive plan, and I suggest people take a look at that. That's a good place to start.
Thank you. Another question we had come in. It says, one of the speakers brought up the issue of the pressure capitalism puts on women to reproduce when birth rates are low. But I think we need to look at this issue with a racialized lens. Currently, the birth rate in the US is at the lowest point it has been in decades. Historically, this has been associated with strategies to increase the white birth rate while forcibly sterilizing and brutalizing Black and brown populations. How do the speakers see this playing out today?
Yeah, it's always been the case that, American social policy is not pro or anti-natal. It's about who is supposed to reproduce and who is punished for reproducing. And that's certainly still true. I mean, Jenny's book lays out really, really thoroughly and beautifully, like the idea that, currently in some countries, the idea is to incentivize an increase in birth rates with more benefits, where in the US, it's to withhold the right to abortion and so forth, and sort of like coerce people in the most awful ways possible to reproduce. And so, we know that we still have all sorts of, the legacy of welfare reform in the 90s and so forth, in which, the idea was to, create family caps and, prevent, people who are not white and middle class from having families. I'm thinking of, the history of sterilization, which, it's sometimes talked about like it's in the ancient past, but only ended in the 70s, but actually didn't end and was part of a California lawsuit, within the last decade. So that's still going on. And, like the great gift of the reproductive justice framework was pointing that out. That was like the starting point, was talking about how only talking about abortion ignored the rampant problem of sterilization. So, those sorts of things are still happening, but I think COVID is a really good example of the fact that a lot of people, in power seem to have made the calculation that, like, yeah, some people are going to die, but not the people we care about. Let's, send working class people of color back to work. Let's reopen schools, because we don't actually care about the lives of these people. Trump talked about nurses running towards hospital as if they were running into war. He said something like, they probably shouldn't do it, but they do, and then people call nurses heroes. And the entire hero framework encourages the public to be okay when nurses die, because, oh, they died in the line of duty. And of course, like, I think most of us would have said always that nurses were certainly heroes. Nurses are incredible. Nurses are holding this society together. And nurses are among the most militant advocates for the things that we need right now. But, when we talk about life and death and the reproduction of life, we're absolutely seeing blood sacrifices right now. And I think, a reproductive justice lens perhaps allows us to see that as part of this history. that the person who asked the question is describing. I'm sorry, that was like a little circuitous, but yeah.
And I think like to that point with like the history of like Margaret Sanger and the eugenics and all that stuff, that was just a couple of years ago, decades ago. We also see like this kind of, maybe not a forcibly sterilization, while that also does still exist, and kind of like this like suggesting, healthcare providers suggesting to Black and brown women who want birth control, long-term forms of birth control, and these invasive forms of birth control, more often than they do with white and middle-class people. So those are also forms of kind of like controlling population. But even on like a less obvious sense, like the high maternal mortality rate in the US is high in general, but is highest among Black women, and how we're literally killing people who are giving birth to Black babies, and then not believing Black birthing people when they say they're in pain, and then that's leading into maternal mortality. So I think even outside of this sterilization and like eugenics that we've seen in the recent past, there's different ways within like the system of racism that we see this kind of like disdain for like Black life, and just kind of like Black people who are birthing, that kind of recreates this like to try to like reduce Black birthing in the US.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing, that was all of what you said. Amen. I think the underlying political question is, that the white power structure is worried about a majority people of color country, which is true in many states already, and also around 2050 it will be a majority people of color country. And so why do they care about this? Well, not because they care so much about white working class people. An insurance company will kill them if it saves them $1, right? But because white people tend to identify with their oppressors who are white, right? This whole trick of whiteness. And so you have, what they see is this specter of the difference between California and Texas, right? Both states are majority people of color at this point. In California, Latino voting power has made a big dent, and so you have pretty good union laws, you have pretty good organizing. There's a lot of laws that that I'm sure people in Texas would like to have that they don't have, because in Texas they've gerrymandered it and made it so that white people's votes are worth more than the votes in say Houston, which is has a lot of people of color. So they're, and they're really fighting against this tide of consciousness and people who are not bought off by this phony whiteness thing. So that's really, I think, the underlying stuff that's causing a lot of the abuses that we're seeing on the border, all the horrible maternal mortality, and maternal morbidity too, which is incredible. The number of people who are really badly injured or sick from having babies. So I think that's the underlying thing that we're seeing, and how they're trying to maintain power in the United States.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I'm going to ask one more question. Thanks to all our panelists for really putting a lot of thought and energy into this. As far as actually, and it would be great to hear from as many of you as would like to respond on this one in particular, as far as actually moving some of what we're all talking about as reproductive justice and socialist care into our lived experience here in the US, whether it's in relationship to everything we're talking about, abortion, maternal care, childcare, incarceration. Are there responses happening at the state, local, or community level that you feel are really lighting the way right now? And what do you think about how we interact as a national movement or national community when we're operating in such different state and local contexts, often, by necessity, because of what's happening at the national level, and like the lack of, I guess, equity in opportunity and action across all the states. So yeah, what do you think about how we interact nationally, given that we operate in such different state and local contexts? And just like one example of, you know, things happening at the more local level, at the state or community level. I'll just give like the example, of course, here in New York City, that universal pre-K was, you know, passed a few years ago to bring education and childcare to 4-year-olds. That would be, you know, public provision. But I'd love to hear about other responses at the micro, local, or state level you guys are thinking about, and how that interacts nationally. Yeah, go ahead, Vanessa.
One of the things that I was sitting with in terms of, you know, seeing the various factions of people's organizing, and that there's not really like a unified justice movement in the United States where we have like a one like unified organizing framework that we can all agree on. And that's something that I've witnessed when I've traveled to other places in the Philippines and Mexico, that folks might have a more nuanced and common understanding of why their justice movement is intersectional. And I think the silver lining that I'm seeing out of everything that's happened with the rising consciousness around police killings of Black people and the disproportionate effects of the COVID crisis on the Black community, it's people that are in very non-politicized factions of the community are starting to look deeply at white supremacy and racial justice. And so one of the things that I think is like, I see that is exciting and I'm more invested in now is how people without any type of political consciousness can be brought into the fold to then understand and undo white supremacy and white privilege, and support and foster that conversation is taking place as a basis for then understanding other types of oppression and the other types of inequality, and how inequality and racial inequality have been the backbone for class inequality and capitalism, but as an entry point that people are really invested in now in 2020, considering the way that media and social media has put it at the forefront, the front and center for folks. And so I'm really interested in supporting and deepening commitment from folks to really look at, I think one of the things that can happen is that whether it's in a socialist community or any other progressive community, we can assume that in the community there is a common understanding that we don't need to talk about the deepness and the embedded nature of white supremacy and white privilege, but it is something that I feel like is going to be an entryway for a broader community to understand why we need to have class equality, and we have to have a deep commitment to justice overall in the many forms, whether it's racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, reproductive justice. I think it's like one of the missing pieces, and I'm excited to see that people, even my white presenting Mexican aunt's knitting community in Sacramento, California, is now reading books about undoing white supremacy. And so I think it's one of the things that folks can be like more deeply invested in now and supporting on a broader level.
Thank you, Vanessa. Would anyone else like to speak to the question of things you feel are lighting the way right now, or how we interact as a national movement given such different state and local contexts?
I mean, there's so much good going on right now, despite or perhaps because of the apocalyptic state of things. And so I would maybe just mention a few things. One is that for a long time, while there has been grassroots organizing around abortion through groups like SisterSong and the National Network of Abortion Funds that do use this wider reproductive justice lens, a lot of the money and a lot of the power has been with larger national groups, and a lot of people's faith has been in the Supreme Court or other national institutions to protect their right to those things, even as access has completely fallen apart. And, you know, with the death of Ginsburg, no one can look to the Supreme Court anymore. You know, I don't think anyone has a lot of hope on the federal level. And so my hope is that This means that everybody who is suddenly very keenly aware of the precariousness of access to abortion will start feeding into these groups that exist on the grassroots level that have been much more radical and better organized, organizing people and not just money. And that, that will be both a moment, to bring more numbers to those organizations, and also for people who might not be familiar with the reproductive justice framework and maybe had thought more in terms of rights and the Supreme Court and so forth, to encounter a stronger framework for looking at those issues. I think there's a lot of potential for that, and the solutions to reproductive questions are going to have to bubble up. They're not coming from the top. And so I think that's one thing. Another is there's a lot of organizing around childcare right now, which is really incredible. Portland and like DSA's work there has been really amazing. I've long wondered, and maybe this is a question for other panelists, why childcare is not at the top of national agendas, because it touches on just like everything we care about. It affects practically anyone with a family. It's a labor issue. It's something that makes way more sense if it's run as a with funding to make it a large program. It's something that's needed absolutely everywhere. And so, if we're getting sort of templates for that being tried at the local level, I think there's some hope that will continue to rise as a national issue. And finally, I just wanted to say that housing is obviously an issue that has a huge amount of energy around it right now because people are being evicted. It's just like a catastrophic issue at this point. Like, you cannot keep a lid on it anymore. Like, I've been seeing eviction defenses in my neighborhood like I haven't seen before. And New York theoretically has protections, but these things are still going on. And looking at Moms for Housing, or looking at the like quite remarkable work that's being done in Philadelphia right now, they have seriously pushed the public housing authority there, which is a horrible public housing authority, into negotiations. And they want to take over some of those buildings and put them in a community administrated land trust. And so there are actually like interesting experiments going on around public housing, democratic governance of public housing, making eviction illegal, that are really, militant and strong right now. And that is something that I think is, those groups are connecting. And that is a major national issue and one of the most interesting things happening in a lot of cities right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And actually, thank you to all of you. We're almost at 9:30, which is supposed to be our official close time. So I really want to thank all of our audience who has been with us tonight, as well as our panelists. Again, Sarah Leonard with Lux Magazine, Jenny Brown with National Women's Liberation, Lakia Williams with SisterSong and Black Feminist Rants, Vanessa Nisperos, and all of you here with us tonight. You'll be receiving follow-up emails, both with a video link to tonight's event if you want to share it with others, or want to look at parts you might have missed because you went to take care of your kids. Or also you'll get follow-up emails about upcoming events we'll be doing on other chapters based around the book We Own the Future. I also want to thank everyone who you can't see who's been working hard behind the scenes here tonight. We have Emily Jenna Kiram from the New Press, Michael Bennett, David Duhalde, and Michael Grachowski from the DSA Fund and from Democratic Socialists of America, and Flynn Murray from Dissent magazine. So please take a look at all the links also that have been shared in the chat. There's a link for a discount on the book We Own the Future. There's links to get the first issue of Lux Magazine coming out. Birth Strike that Jenny Brown shared, and also to hear Lakia Williams podcasts that are ongoing as well. And links to some of our previous events on this topic. So we really hope that folks have enjoyed the conversation. I've gotten a lot out of it. I really appreciate all our panelists contributing their time tonight. And we look forward to moving forward for more than survival and to all thrive. So thank you all for being here with us tonight. We'll be in touch soon. Good night.
Thank you for having us.